Okay, so welcome to the Epic Photography Podcast. This is episode 003, and today we'll be talking about starting your photo editing journey, hopefully the right way. Today I have with me my Team Epic friends from Ireland, Cathy Baitson, also known as Katie Weatherstone. Hi Katie, how are you?
Not too bad, and how's yourself?
Good, and also from England, Peter Treadway. Hello, Peter. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, Nando. Thank you very much.
Good. Well, so I'm Fernando Santos, also known as Chiqui Nando. I'm based in Lisbon, Portugal. And first question for today will be, are you JPEG or RAW? Shall we start editing with JPEG or editing with RAW? What do you guys want to say about that?
Well, I go first, Peter.
Go for it. Go on.
Okay, so in the camera and the settings, I have RAW plus JPEG. And, well, to be honest with you, I don't know why, because I always edit in RAW. Like everything when I upload it to Lightroom is RAW. So, but sometimes if I'm bracketing a shot, I use the JPEGs to kind of put them together sometimes. So I'd rather have both there as an option rather than just have either one or the other. So that's my answer to that. So, Peter?
For me, it's raw all the way. There's no point in even shooting JPEG. So from the very moment I got my DSLR, I think maybe for the first couple of days I was shooting JPEG, and then I found out what RAW actually was and what RAW images were, and conversely what JPEGs or what the camera did to create a JPEG. And effectively, when you take a RAW image, when you take an image with your DSLR, the image that you see on the screen on the back of your camera is effectively a JPEG. So I could go on forever about this, but it's too long for this podcast. But effectively, sometimes when you open your images in your chosen editing software, you might think, well, hang on, this looks completely different to the image that I saw on the back of my camera. The reason for that is that when you take that image, the camera immediately, to show you that image on the back of the camera, it bakes in a number of settings. So contrast, saturation, vibrance, those sort of things, to show you a pleasing representation of what you've just taken. When you then take that raw image into your editing software, you are getting the complete data, the full raw data. And then you obviously need to manipulate that to get it to look how you want it to look or how you imagined it looking at the time. Now, the problem with shooting just JPEG is when the camera will always take a raw image, whether you're set to RAW or JPEG, it will always take a raw image. But if your camera is set to JPEG, it will immediately get rid of loads of data after it bakes in these contrast, saturation, vibrance settings and loads of other different things. So it bakes those settings in and it kicks out to the memory card the JPEG image. Now, the problem is when you then take that into your editing software, whatever you choose it to be, and we'll get onto that in a minute, when you take it into that software, you've lost so much functionality. And funnily enough, I did an article on this a little while ago, whether to shoot RAW or JPEG. And I used an image that I took in America of a train running through the desert. And the raw image, I could manipulate to within an inch of its life. I could change the exposure. I think I could change the exposure by up to about 2.5 stops before it really started to lose its detail and its definition. But when you try to do the same with the JPEG image, it very quickly the highlights blow out, or you get too many blacks in the shadows. But even something as changing the vibrance. So I was trying to make the sky. There was a beautiful blue sky with some beautiful white fluffy clouds. When I tried to change the blue luminance, immediately you started to see it was pixelating, and so when I was trying to edit the JPEG image. So the point, this breathless ramble that I'm going on about, basically what I'm saying is you are doing your images a massive disservice by simply shooting in JPEG. By shooting in RAW, you give yourself all that extra data. And yes, it takes up more space on your memory card. It takes up more space on your computer, on your hard drive, whatever storage you've got at home. But in the long run, you're doing your images a massive disservice by only shooting in JPEG. Memory storage these days is so cheap comparatively that if you fill one of your memory cards, just buy another one, stick that in, and you will have that raw data, that raw imagery. And the other thing that I always say to people is, and I know I'm rambling and I'll stop talking, but the other thing I say to people is, you may think now, well, I don't need all that data. I'm only shooting pictures of the family barbecue, or or I'm going out for a day and I'm just taking a couple of snaps. You never know when you will want to look back on those images in the future. I've got images that I took 9-10 years ago, and I will suddenly come across them on my hard drive, and I'll think, wow, I never got around to these. I completely forgot about these, but actually these are really good images, and I really want, and you'll sit down and you'll edit them. If you only have the JPEG versions of them, you're so heavily restricted in how you can edit them. So for me, as you might have guessed, RAW is the only way to go.
I did mean to say everything you said there, Peter. Honest to God.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm sure you concur.
But can I ask you something? Where was that article that you wrote that for? Do you remember?
I think it was on DIY photography. Yeah. I'll have to look it up, and I'll link it in the show notes. I'll find the article and I'll link it.
Good.
Thanks.
That sounds good. So I'll add to what Peter said. It's clearly RAW. That's the way to go. I can understand people starting into photography when you're getting your raw image, you really don't know what you should do. Basically, you have the raw material and you need to cook it. And it's so much easier to have your JPEG because engineers on your camera brand, Canon or Nikon or Sony or whatever brand you shoot, created out of the raw data, created a baked image for you that would be the JPEG. But you can take Katie's approach if you're not comfortable at the moment. You shoot JPEG and RAW. You use the JPEGs immediately, and you save the RAWs for in 10 years, as Peter was saying. You'll go back to those and you'll use them, even if it's family events. Remember, we don't live forever, and in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, you will lose some family members. Unfortunately, that's the way it works. And then you have the raw images, and then you can create beautiful prints and edits and all that. So it's clearly go with raw, and you can still use JPEGs if you want. There's some things. I'm thinking you guys both shoot weddings, right? So you might need, for those photos that people want to see like immediately, you probably might need the JPEGs, but that will be probably a discussion for a future episode. So I'll leave that to you guys. But there's certain, for example, sports that you might want to have JPEG. But again, if you can keep JPEG and RAW, or at least RAW, that's what I do. It's a good thing. So we have RAW for sure, and that's a good thing, I think. So the next question is, are you going to edit your photos into Photoshop, Lightroom, something else? What do you guys do?
Well, I bring mine straight into Lightroom, because if I'm doing newborns or even weddings, I like to cull them by using pick, unpick. And I just think it's just quicker for me. And sometimes I would have a basic setting that I would just sync throughout the whole lot, like a starter setting. So that's where I start off, is in Lightroom. And then after Lightroom, I take them into Photoshop, especially if there's something I need skin edits or objects removed, or blemishes and stuff like that, because I don't think that Lightroom does a great job in removing blemishes. Well, definitely not as good as Photoshop. So, I mean, some people have that nailed, they can use it, but for me, I definitely go to Photoshop to finish off. So if I'm doing a wedding, a lot of them is just edited in Lightroom, unless I need to do something extra to the shots, I would bring them into Photoshop. So that's even but newborns, all my newborns are brought into Lightroom. Then I select by doing P for pick, to flag them, and then unpick, and I kind of go back and forth and cull right down. And then I don't edit any of them in Lightroom. everything goes straight into Photoshop with newborn because there's a lot of skin editing and background editing and stuff like that. So that's my workflow. So I know Peter doesn't use Lightroom, and we've had this discussion. So I'm dying to hear what he has to say because
we're going to have it again.
Yeah, I've said to him so many times, I'm like, how can you just, not use Lightroom? Like, and I've put him up to a challenge. Like, so the next time he's over shooting a wedding with me, which is in a few weeks' time, I'm going to have him. I have 2 computers and I'm going to have him beside me and I'm going to go. And we're going to take a number of shots and just see, how I cull them and how he culls them, because like it baffles me now how he does it, to be honest with you. So over to Peter now. This is what I am so looking forward to hearing this.
Peter, let me just say this. I'm also a Lightroom guy, so tell us all about it.
Well, so controversially then, and I'll try and make this speech less rambly than the last one and less oratory. So for me, I started out in Photoshop, and I think it's one of those things where it's just whatever you get used to. And so when I was a student, actually, when I was doing an online distance learning course, so I managed to get a copy of Photoshop CS5, I think it was, or it may even have been CS4, when you had to pay £700 for the full standalone package. But I think I got it on the student price for about £200. And at the time when I first started photography, I'd never heard of Lightroom. Photoshop was one of those words. It had become a verb. So, that image has been Photoshopped, the verb to Photoshop something. And so when you thought of image editing software, Photoshop was the first thing that came to mind. So, of course, I went looking for that and I started using that. As I started using it, and I then started joining various online forums and Facebook groups for editing software, one of the biggest complaints that I saw when I learned about Lightroom and what Lightroom was and what it did was people complaining about the catalog structure. Now, I'm not going to go deep into this because, as we've already found out,
I will.
I'm not. Nando can explain it all. I'm not a Lightroom user, so I don't understand the catalog. Yeah, how the catalog system works. But the main complaint I heard from people were people panicking. I've just moved computers, or I've done this on my computer and I can't find my images. My catalog's now corrupted. And I was just thinking to myself, thank God I'm using Photoshop. And I'll come on to this later. I organize all my files completely in Finder on my Mac. And I have fully detailed and expanded folders within Finder. So I can find everything really simply. I couldn't get my head around Lightroom. I think Photoshop is obviously the more powerful system. Photoshop can do everything Lightroom can, but then more. So once I'd started learning Photoshop and I got my head around it, and I thought, well, there's no real point in kind of going backwards. But I know the amount of time, every time I go to Ireland to shoot a wedding with Cathy, or every time she comes over here, she's on at me. She's like my mother in my ear. You've got to do this. You've got to. And constantly, that's so much easier doing it this way. And all credit to her, she's very fast in Lightroom. But whenever I watch her, I just think to myself, I can't help thinking that I'm doing this at exactly the same speed in Photoshop. So when I open my images, I open the raw images into Adobe Camera Raw, which, again, I understand is kind of...
It's the same.
The developed module in Lightroom. So it's the same thing. So I do all of my culling and all of my basic edits. And to be honest, with most of my weddings now, I rarely go into Photoshop proper. I don't, unless I need to, take out something completely in the background or blemish removal tool or cut. If I'm swapping heads, if someone's blinked in an image and having to swap heads from one image to another, then I'll go into the main program. But largely, I open 200 to 300 images at a go in Adobe Camera Raw. I hit the backspace on the ones that I don't want to edit. I edit the ones that I do. And then when I click done or save directly from Adobe Camera Raw, it goes into a folder of my choice. And I can then just upload them straight onto my photo hosting website for my clients to view. So for me, as I say, I understand that Lightroom, people say that Lightroom is quicker, but I think it's just the workflow that I've developed over the years. I think I'm very very fast at the way that I use Photoshop. And again, having watched Cathy do it, she is very fast in Lightroom. But when I watch her, I can't help thinking that I do things much the same way in much the same amount of time.
Can I ask you something, Peter? Have you ever used Bridge?
No.
No, neither have I.
No.
Have you ever used it, Nando?
Well, I used it, but not as my main tool. So I've used it just because I had to see it so that I can say something about it. I think it's an important tool if you have files that are not just photography. If you go into different files, then Bridge can handle different kinds of files. So it's an important tool if you have like InDesign and Illustrator, Photoshop, and you have all different kinds of files that Bridge does help. But apart from that, I'm not a Bridge user. I do use Lightroom and I do use Photoshop the same way that Katie does. It's just that it's the catalog thing that Peter was telling me, and being on the Kelby One community for years, and that problem still exists. Like Lightroom just lost all my photos. And this is something that I hear almost not every day, but like every week there's someone saying, well, I just lost everything because Lightroom just deleted my photos. And the thing with the catalog is the problem is not Lightroom, is that people don't understand how the Lightroom catalog works. And it's so easy. You need, if you understand this, you'll have a much easier life, and your images will be there like forever. The problem is that Lightroom, when you are importing photos into Lightroom, this is the problem. You are not importing your photos into Lightroom. You're just telling Lightroom, hey, Lightroom, I have my images on these folders. Can you keep track of them for me? Just know that my images are at this location inside my hard drive. And people think because they imported them into Lightroom that the images exist inside the Lightroom catalog, and they don't. Lightroom just keeps a link to the images where the images exist inside your hard drive. So what people do, and that's why they lose their images, is that they import into Lightroom. They think that, okay, I've imported them, I can delete them. And then when they delete them, the images are actually deleted and they don't exist inside Lightroom. Lightroom just has a little thumbnail, just a little JPEG that represents your image, sure, and a link to where the images are. So that's why people lose their images.
So it's just a shortcut link, effectively. It's just
exactly.
You're importing a shortcut to where the image sits
you're,
on your file system.
You're creating a shortcut to your image. That's it. And the thing is that people then realize that, well, I'm running out of hard drive space. So, well, I have these folders here for images that I imported ages ago, so I can delete these. And then they do, and they lose their images.
Lose their images.
Yeah, that's what happens.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah,
Yes,
I've lost mine a few times.
Yeah, and I never seen Lightroom actually deleting the images unless you tell Lightroom to delete the images.
Yeah.
And it will ask you, do you really want to delete the images? I mean, from the catalog or from your hard drive? So it's not something that you do without knowing. And Lightroom doesn't go in the middle of the night, oh, let's delete these ones because these are not good, or these are the greatest ones, so let's ruin the day and delete the images.
Trash them.
Lightroom doesn't do that. So it's just because people don't understand how it works.
I didn't like that edit he did earlier, so I'm just going to get rid of this image completely. It's Lightroom's vindictive. No, we're not saying that. We're not saying that.
Yeah.
But so no, I have definitely. I lost all of mine on an update once, but the only thing that you have to back them up regularly. Yes. Because like so many times, I was in the middle of a wedding and the night before I went to bed, I said, so I'm just going to back this up. And it wasn't you. I'd probably back it up once a week. But I was like, I'm just going to do it tonight because, just let it run while I'm around in case, my computer sleeps or something happens. But anyway, and I'm so glad I did, because the next day, everything crashed on me. And so because I backed them up, I was able to retrieve them. But I'm just also thinking, Peter, you must have an awful lot of space on your computer because you don't have all the Lightroom files that we do. So that's another plus, really, when you think about it.
I have a Drobo drive with currently 4 10 terabyte drives in there. And yeah, they're filling up fast.
Yeah.
And that is I guess the only problem with it. But then at least I know where my images are, and I get what Nando's saying, that and if you don't delete your images, then Lightroom will never lose them effectively. But I just like the way that I can organize my images by year, by month, and then by date and couple, or who the couple are. It works for me. And again, going back to what I was saying earlier, it's the workflow you get into. It's very difficult. As they say, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. It's very difficult once you're into that workflow, even if another workflow may be slightly faster or the same speed. It's very difficult to then say, right, well, I'll completely change and start doing it this way. Once you're used to something, if it works for you, then I think, well, if it's not broken, why fix it?
Well,
Exactly.
Peter, tell us about your workflow. How do you do that? Where you're just returned from a shoot and
Yep.
you have your camera and your memory cards. How do you do that?
So immediately get back from the wedding, memory cards come out, and straight into my Mac, and I download all of all of the images into Finder. So my file structure is weddings, and I have a number of different categories. So if I'm doing a charity event or any kind of event, or anything, I have all those different categories. So it'll go to weddings. Within weddings, I then have all the years. So going back to, blimey, when did I start shooting weddings? About 13 years ago. So 2009, 2010, 2011, I can then go into that folder and it will tell me, so I'll know all the weddings that I shot that year will be in there. Once I get in there, I then have date listed by month and then the day. So September 21st dash couple's name. But what I'll also then have is a duplicate folder almost under that, which will have so it will be exactly the same name structure. So they'll sit above and below each other. But the bottom one will be the raw images. So the top one will be the JPEGs, the completed JPEGs. The bottom one will be the raw images. Once all the raw images are in that folder, as I say, I will then go into that folder. Oh, sorry, but then within that raw folder, I could use possibly 3 cameras at a wedding. So I'll use my 2 Nikons, my D700 and my D810. But then now more frequently, I'm using this camera that I'm using at the moment, the Canon R6 as well, which I use mainly to take video, but I will take some stills with it. So then within that couples folder, that individual couples folder, I'll have individual camera folders as well. So I'll have my D810, D700 and R6 folders. All the individual images then go into those folders. From those folders, I will then open 200 to 300 images at a time into Adobe Camera Raw. I'll run through the film strip at the bottom. I'll go through them one by one, clicking backspace on the ones that I don't want, whether they be blinks or duplicates or anything like that. When I get to the end of that 200 or 300 images, I then save into the folder above the raw folder, if that makes sense, the completed images, and then they all go in there again in camera order. So again, in my completed images folder, I'll have D700, D810, R6. Once that's done for all the images, they then get uploaded to my photo hosting site, Zenfolio. I put them into order, and then it gets sent out to the couple. And that's it. So, and for me, that works perfectly. I can do a whole wedding day edit in 4 or 5 hours, maybe, depending on how many images I've taken and how many events there were on the day. I can get that done in about 4 or 5 hours.
Well, I'm surprised. Like it seems a lot of messing around with folders and the cameras and things. It's like, okay, which camera did I use? Which camera did I use to make that photo that I really think that it's going to be an awesome photo? So, well, you know which one you did, of course, because you did the shot. But I
don't know whether it's my OCD nature, but I do even quite a way in the future. I do tend to remember the best shots from a wedding. I will remember which camera they were taken on, and I don't know whether. I think it's probably more to do with the age of the camera, I think, because as you go through cameras, every time you get a new camera, obviously you naturally imagine that the images from that camera are better. And so when I first got my D700, that was my first full frame camera, and then my backup for that became the Nikon D300S, I think. And they were worlds apart. The D700 from the D300S. One is obviously a full frame. The other one is a prosumer camera. So it's the top end of the Nikon's consumer line, or it was at the time. And so the images from the D700 matched with the 70-200 f2.8 lens that I was using there. It was like night and day, the difference between the images. And then maybe a year or so went by, and I then got the Nikon D810, and I got that the very day it was released. And so, again, those images, to my mind, were fantastic. So any images from a wedding that were going to be any good, in my mind, were going to come from that camera. And so equally now, moving on again, now I've got the Canon R6. It's such an amazing camera, it being mirrorless, and the image quality and the resolution is just beautiful. And so now, naturally, I think the images I take with that camera are the better ones, if that makes sense. So it just kind of, I go through the progression of the chronology, the timeline of the cameras that I bought, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, you think about it.
Still sounds confusing to me, but
well, this is what I was going to say earlier.
How do you do your workflow?
Well, this is the thing, you see. This is what I was going to say, right? So myself and Peter, we do weddings. I edit my photos and he edits his. Okay, so and one thing we do need to sort out that we haven't done yet, and we keep saying it all the time.
Every time. I know exactly what you're going to say.
Go on, do you want to say it?
Syncing the camera clocks up.
Yes, yeah. So
that's so easy to fix in Lightroom.
I know you can do it in Lightroom as well, and I have done it like that too. But so what I do is when I get my folders, and I put them into the card reader and put them onto obviously an external hard drive. I go in and I have different folders like bride prep, groom prep, ceremony. So I edit per folder. And when I like Peter uses Zenfolio, but I use Shootproof. So I have the different folders in there, and I would have groom prep, bride prep. And when I deliver them on USB, that's how I deliver them as well. Groom prep, bride prep, ceremony, dancing. And so they know where they can find their images. So they, rather than sifting through the whole lot all the way down, they just go, oh, it was, remember that picture that where I was on the dance floor giving it lots, and you remember that one? Oh God, let me see where that is, and straight into the dancing folder, and there it is. So that's the way I do it, and that's just the way I think is more suitable. Well, for the way I work anyway,
And forever we will disagree.
I know. I'm surprised we're still friends, Peter.
Exactly.
We have so much fun.
One thing we need to do next time you have a wedding, you get the groom and bride say, well, there's a perfect destination, which happens to be not very expensive, perfect weather, the food is amazing. And that's Portugal. And if you guys come over for a wedding here, and I'll join you as a third shooter, and then I'll show you how to do that.
Okay, you organize that.
We know how to sync the clocks. In my defense, the problem is, so whenever I fly to Dublin, Cathy or her husband picks me up from the airport, we drive straight to Cathy's house. I literally have time to put my suitcase in the front door, and we're back out. She knows exactly what I'm going to say. We're back out of the door, into a car, into a cab, to the pub, and there are 3 Guinnesses lined up in front of me. So I don't even have time to remove my camera from my suitcase when I arrive in Ireland. So I'm completely blameless in this equation.
Yeah. See, I started welcoming him to Ireland that way, and, it just has to continue now.
You know what's the problem is, Peter? You need to take a flight like an hour before. You're flying too late.
He just drink more.
That's the reason.
I could get there at 7 o'clock in the morning, and Cathy would have the Guinnesses lined up for me.
We have to have a 3-pint limit because we're photographing the wedding the next day. But in Ireland, my God, even that morning they'd be shoving them at you, and you're like, no, thanks.
Well, I never shot a wedding, so you certainly have requirements that I'm not used to. My workflow is a lot, easier, I think. So I follow this approach and this is a good idea for Lightroom users, and eventually also for Photoshop or any other application, photo editing application that you might use. is get a folder where you have all your images below that one, and then you sort in different ways, in different categories or whatever, or by year, and well, you pick the one that works best for you. But having a single folder where all the other folders exist below, that's a must, because it will make backup a lot easier. It will make copying from one drive to a bigger one when you need to um, replace your hard drive, either because it's becoming small or because it's becoming old and you should replace it before it dies. So having all the images below a single folder, call it pictures, call it my pictures, call it photos, whatever you want. So I have such a folder, and then below that one, I'll name the event. And I've shot some sports, I've shot music events, family things, so just landscapes, whatever. So I have below that folder, I have all my other folders where I just, when I get from a shoot, I take the card out of my camera, stick it into the card reader, and so far it's similar to Peter's workflow. I'll just copy into a folder on my hard drive where I know exactly where I put those images. And I just have a single folder. There's no raw and different cameras and everything. Even if I shoot with different cameras, I have the luxury of having, well, not having 3 Guinness in front of me. I can sync my clocks before. And that's when you're shooting like a music event, like a rock concert or something, and you're having a telephoto on one camera body and a wide angle lens on another one. And suddenly you see, if you don't have your clocks in sync, and you guys at the wedding understand this, but someone that didn't shoot with 2 cameras probably don't understand the need to have your clock synced. So it's important. But even if I forget to do that, I can easily do it inside Lightroom, because I can select the photos by the camera that I use, by the lens that I use, whatever. So it's really easy. So I copy my images into my folder on my computer, and then I'll go into my Lightroom catalog, and I'll just import from that folder. So it's a lot faster than having Lightroom importing from the camera, which a lot of people do. They connect the camera with the USB cable to the hard drive and import direct from the camera. I just use the card reader, copy to the hard drive, and then I use Lightroom to just add those images into my catalog. And from then on, it's all Lightroom, and I can select by camera, I can select by lens, and then I just create my collections, and I work from there. So it's a single folder. I can drop all the images from all different cameras into the same folder, and it's a lot easier for me to find that. So we'll have to get together on a wedding shoot.
I want to say one thing. Your initial file structure, where you have one folder for your images and then below that you have all your events, it sounds very similar to what I do.
Yeah, it is, except that I don't do it by ear and then by...
Okay, I see.
But it makes sense if I was doing a weather... what did I say? If I was doing a weather?
Doing the weather. You've my last name in your head, haven't you?
I wish I could change the weather, but if I was doing a weather... did I say it again? If I was shooting a wedding... Got it right this time.
Got it
Yeah.
So
right.
if I was shooting a wedding, probably I would have a weddings folder, and then eventually by ear. That would make sense, because that's the way it works. So it would make sense. But that's not what I do. So I have a similar structure, but I don't need to go into, let's say that I was shooting events. A rock concert for the same band over 5 years. Probably I'll have my photos, rock concerts, band, whatever, and 2010, 2011, 2012, so on and so forth, like you do with weddings. So that's probably the same structure. The thing is that all that goes into Lightroom, and it's a lot, well, to my point of view, it's a lot easier to manage all that. But the folders, the structure, it's the same.
So I presume
Okay,
both
guys,
of
so let's check the time that we have. Okay,
it?
we should go about giving like 5 tips. Each one will go around and give 5 tips for our readers to. Well, we still not need to go about
I need
this.
to-
explain
Yeah,
these
Peter, do
readers
you want
in,
to
but-
do you want to just get that out of the way and explain this?
No,
I would,
not
but we're
now,
running out of
not
time.
now.
That's
We're
the-
running out of
So,
time.
this is his.
We'll go into the 5 tips. Well, let's start with you first, Cathy. So go ahead. 1 tip for our readers.
Okay, learn shortcuts. I think would be because to have a faster workflow, you need to know your shortcuts. Like even for anything, even for the P, for to select a flag and unpick, and the U for unpick. What else?
Well, the X for remove the...
Command D for deselect, and Control J to duplicate an image. All those just make your workflow much quicker. So definitely use shortcuts. Learn to use shortcuts. I suppose that would be my main one.
Okay. One tip for you, Peter.
Oh, one. I've created 5. I think
Yes,
it's
well,
not
you
so
just
much-
you just go with one. We'll go round.
We'll go round, do a round robin.
Oh God, I
So
think more.
for Photoshop especially, get your head around non-destructive editing and specifically the use of layers. So when you take your image into Photoshop, anything you do to that background layer, you obviously have the beauty sometimes of Command or Control Z to go back. But obviously the history state within Photoshop will only let you go back a certain amount. So if you find that you're 100 adjustments on and you think, oh no, I've done something there and I shouldn't have done that. If you're working on that background layer, you have done what is called a destructive adjustment. So you have destroyed part of that image to change it. Going back to what Cathy was saying about learning your shortcuts, just do a quick Command J in Photoshop to duplicate that layer. Any edits you then make are purely on that upper layer. You're leaving your background layer completely as is. And so if you then need to go back or if you need to change anything, you can add a layer mask to just get rid of the particular adjustment that you've made. So really get your head around non-destructive editing and the use of layers and layer masks and brushes. And there's a plethora of videos and tutorials online. But from the very beginning, if you can get your head... Photoshop is effectively just layers, layer masks, blend modes, and brushes. If you can get your head around those 4 things, and they're really not that difficult, get your head around those things at the beginning, and you'll be flying.
Okay, that's a good tip, certainly. So, well, I'll add one that is not related specifically to Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever editing application you're using. We're talking about organizing your files. And my tip is organize them in a way that if you passed away today, someone else from your family would be able to locate whatever image they wanted.
That's good. I like that.
So think about that and forget. Well, I know Peter, I'm sorry about that, but I have to say this. Peter knows that the latest camera has the best photo in there. But if someone wanted that photo, and I get that weddings is a different thing, but let's say someone passed away, you have this hard drive with thousands of images and you want to go into those folders and locate the image that you want. Think not just, okay, I know exactly where I put them. Think that organize those folders by names in a way that if you pass away, and you will sooner or later, I'm sorry, if you're not aware of that, that's going to happen. Sooner or later, it will happen. So make sure that someone else using that hard drive will be able to locate the image on that. So, Katie, let's get another tip from you.
You know, funny enough, you should say that, but 2 of my friends, close friends, died over the last few months. And I am the only one that I had my first camera at 12 years of age, and I'm the only one that has photographs of all our group from all those years ago. I mean, I've all their 21st photographs. But when I got them done, I printed them and gave the family a copy. So anytime somebody passes away, the first thing they do is come to me and they go, "Cathy, have you any photographs?" Now, only just before I went to America there a couple of weeks ago, I actually have a box beside me, right? I wonder if I can, it's probably just in a bit there, but it's a box about this size. And while I was sifting through them, I put every single photograph from those group of friends into that. And I said at the funeral, I said, the one thing I'm going to do when I come back is I'm going to scan all those images, every single one of them. And I'm going to put them somewhere where if anything happened to me, that they'll all have access to them. So that's what I'm going to do with mine. I'm going to, over the next couple of weeks, scan all those images and put them in a file and put them on the cloud somewhere, or send them to, send them a link or send them to them all so they have them all. So
Print
because,
them.
yeah.
Print them.
Do you know what I mean? And another thing I was going to say, I know when we got on here, we were talking about, how we edit our, work, Lightroom, Photoshop, but there are other softwares out there like, you have where you don't have to subscribe to the cloud. You can get the likes of, you could just buy the Lightroom Elements, isn't it? And Photoshop Elements or
It's
whatever.
Photoshop Elements,
and Affinity software. So they're just one-off payments. So if you're just learning, rather, you don't have to subscribe to the cloud at first. You can get those software too. Or there's other ones, On One, and there's a few Capture One, isn't it? There's I don't use,
Exposure, there's
Luminar,
DxO,
there's just so many. There's so many out there. So
I actually started shooting when I started shooting weddings. I was editing images in Google Picasa. I'm not sure that even exists anymore, but it was Google's online. In fact, it wasn't online. It was you had to download. You downloaded it.
Was that your first one?
That was my very first wedding back in 2009 when I was too young. But yeah, I was using, and I was doing. I remember it's so cringy. I was doing, and no disrespect to anyone who does this now, because it's one of those things. It's almost like a rite of passage as a photographer. You have to go through this. But I was using, selective color, where the whole image is black and white, and then you just choose one part of the image. That's I know it's
we've
really
all done
cliche.
it. We've all done
it's
it.
Really cliche
because it was the thing.
I'm not going to criticize anyone for doing it, because again, it is a rite of passage. When you become a photographer and you learn editing software, it's just one of those things. You make the whole image black and white, and you select one part of it to be color. But you
okay,
could do
so
that.
you're hold on. We're losing track of what we're doing. We're talking tips, and suddenly you're talking selective color. I guess your tip will be don't do selective color.
Don't do selective color. Don't do
Is that your
selective
tip?
color. Try it, but never share it anywhere, because it's it's too cliche. But no, my last tip, I would say, because you guys have actually organizing your files using the shortcuts. They were two of mine as well. So my last one within Photoshop is create custom actions for any editing that you're repeating over and over again. So if you're doing something as advanced as skin softening, you can create a whole list of like a playable action, and effectively it's as simple as clicking record. You then go through the motions of doing each action, individual action, and then you click stop recording, and then you name it, and then it's in your actions folder. And so you then bring the next image in and you click play. And all of those actions that you've just recorded, it goes through them in order, and your image then turns out exactly the same as the last one. So getting your head around create custom actions can save you a huge amount of time.
Yeah, that's a good tip. It's something that scares a lot of people. You guys know that I have an IT background for many years, so that's like really easy for me to create. I've been used to programming and things, so actions is something very cool that I find very interesting, and it's a good one. I'll add one other tip, and that's a Lightroom tip. Use just one catalog. Again, my IT background in the beginning, the first versions of Lightroom, there was the thing that if you had, I don't even know how many, but let's say 65,000 photos in the catalog, and if it grew above that, then the catalog would start behaving in a bad way or something. Those days are over. You can have hundreds of thousands of photos inside just one catalog, and it makes it a lot easier to handle than having to have a lot catalogs, which is something that I did in the past. And just stick to one catalog. That's the best way to go. Katie, one more tip from you.
Well, my other tip was what Peter said. So I can't think of anything else offhand apart from, but kind of the same thing in Lightroom, is that I have a beginner's, like a starting action kind of preset, basically. In Lightroom, it's presets. And that I would, just a starter one, and that I would sync across just to give me that first. And like with the newborns, if I would start off either, I think about 5x7s and just do them all 5x7s, because I don't do 6x4s, and I can't. Well, if they want them, you know, or 3x2, it depends what way you're cropping them at. But when I do prints, they're 8x10s, 5x7s. So sometimes I would do that and then put the crop in and then sync them across as well. But that's what I was going to say what Peter said. I have actions in Photoshop that, you know, save a bunch of time. If you know, put your own action in and save it and just use that action all the time. It just saves a hell of a lot of time. So.
Okay.
And
so
just
Peter,
while I'm here, the very, very, very first editing software I used was GIMP, and it was free. So
yeah,
just
and it still is, and it still
is there. I think it still is. Yeah,
it is. So. Yeah. So Peter, one last tip from you, because we are running out of time.
Oh gosh, well that was it. I think I exhausted.
Oh, you had the tip that Katie had,
that Cathy had, and the one that you had, and so I'm
okay.
I'm
so
out.
I'll drop one more to save you both, and that will be a Lightroom tip. And sometimes people complain that Lightroom is slow, and in fact, it's slow because they're doing it the wrong way. So usually people say, oh, I need to go out to this other application to call my photos, and because Lightroom is so slow. And in fact, the problem is that you're doing it the wrong way. And the right way to call your photos is using the library model inside Lightroom, not the development model, which is what most people end up doing. So when you're calling your photos, picking the ones that you want to keep or edit, do that inside the library module. Okay. So that would be my tip for today. I think this idea of going out with a run of tips, that is something that we might do on a future episode.
Yeah.
So I think we're running out of time today, right? So
time flies when you're having fun.
Wrap up. Okay, so let me close this episode for the three of us, since you're running out of time. And I want to thank you, dear readers, for joining us this week on the Epic Photography Podcast, brought to you by our epic sponsor, Platypod, the world's most compact tripod base. Next week, there is another epic lineup waiting for you. We'll have Hilmer Smith, Dave Williams, and Scott Kelby, and I know for a fact that they will be talking about something epic. So until then, remember to follow us on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. We are at Epic Photography Podcast. We are also on Twitter at Epic Photopod. Our website is epicphotographypodcast.com, where you can find all podcast feeds, previous episodes, and many other bits and pieces. Also, visit us on our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Epic Photography Podcast. And remember to join our community there. Show us your photos, tell us what you want to hear us discuss here in the Epic Photography Podcast. We'll be back next week. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Slán.